Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where you feel like you're constantly walking on eggshells? Where your words are carefully chosen, your actions meticulously planned, all to maintain a delicate balance that feels like it could shatter at any moment? Or perhaps you're the one who always seems to have the final say, the one whose mood determines the emotional climate of your home. What if I told you that these dynamics aren't accidental? That they reveal something profound about who you are, who you believe yourself to be, and most importantly, what you believe you deserve. Michel Foucault, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, observed something that few people have the courage to admit. Power is not just in governments or corporations. It flows through every human interaction, every conversation, every silent moment between two people who claim to love each other. And nowhere is this power more evident, more consequential, and more revealing than in our intimate relationships. Today, we're going to explore the hidden power dynamics that shape your relationships, the invisible forces that determine who speaks and who listens, who gives and who takes, who stays and who leaves. Because once you see these patterns, you can never unsee them, and only then can you begin to transform them. This isn't about blame. It's not about labeling someone as the villain and someone as the victim. It's about awareness, about understanding that every relationship is a mirror, reflecting not just who you are, but who you believe yourself to be in relation to others. And sometimes, that reflection shows us things we'd rather not see. So I ask you now, are you ready to look at your relationships with clear eyes? To see the power dynamics that have been operating beneath the surface all along? Because what you're about to discover might challenge everything you thought you knew about your connections with others and yourself. Let's begin. You walk into a room where your partner is sitting. What's the first thing that happens? Do they look up, acknowledging your presence? Or do you find yourself making small noises, clearing your throat, doing whatever it takes to be noticed? This moment, this seemingly insignificant interaction, already contains within it the essence of your relationship's power dynamic. Power in relationships isn't about who earns more money or who makes the big decisions. These are merely the surface manifestations of something much deeper. Real power lies in attention, in who feels the need to be seen and who feels entitled to look away, in who interrupts and who gets interrupted, in whose emotions are centered and whose are dismissed. Think about the last argument you had with your partner. Who spoke more? Who had to explain themselves repeatedly? Who felt the need to raise their voice to be heard? And who remained calm, perhaps even silent, knowing their silence would be more impactful than any words? These patterns didn't begin yesterday. They were established in the early days of your relationship, perhaps even before your first date. They were set in motion by your past experiences, your childhood wounds, your beliefs about what love should look like. And once established, they became the invisible architecture of your relationship, rarely discussed, yet influencing every interaction. Foucault would observe that we often mistake these power dynamics for personality traits. She's just more emotional. He's naturally decisive. But what if these aren't inherent qualities? What if they're roles we've been conditioned to play? Positions we've assumed in response to the positions taken by others? The truth is, we all participate in these dynamics, often unconsciously. The person who always yields isn't simply nice. They've learned that yielding prevents conflict, that their worth depends on keeping others happy. The person who dominates isn't simply strong. They've learned that control prevents vulnerability, that their worth depends on never showing weakness. But here's what most relationship advice gets wrong. These dynamics aren't fixed. They're not destiny. They're patterns that can be recognized, understood, and transformed. And the first step is seeing them clearly. In the next part, we'll explore how these dynamics first take root in our lives, long before we ever meet our partners. Because to understand the power dynamics in your relationship, you must first understand how power has shaped your sense of self from the very beginning. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. When you were a child, what happened when you cried? Were you comforted or were you told to be quiet? What happened when you expressed anger? Were you allowed to feel it or were you punished for it? These early experiences weren't just parenting choices. They were your first lessons in power. Family therapist Salvador Minuchin observed that every family has its own power structure, unspoken rules about who can express what emotions, whose needs take priority, who must adapt to whom. As children, we don't question these rules. We internalize them. We shape ourselves to fit them. And then, as adults, we recreate them in our intimate relationships, often without realizing it. If you grew up in a home where one parent dominated and the other accommodated, you likely learned that love looks like dominance or submission. If your emotional needs were consistently dismissed, you learned that your feelings don't matter. That connection requires self-erasure. If expressing yourself led to conflict, you learned that peace requires silence. These lessons become what psychologists call internal working models, mental templates for how relationships function. They operate beneath conscious awareness, guiding who you're attracted to, how you behave with them, what feels familiar and therefore right, even when it causes pain. This explains why so many of us find ourselves in relationships that mysteriously recreate the emotional climate of our childhood homes. The woman who grew up with a dismissive father finds herself with a partner who doesn't listen. The man who was expected to be the strong one as a child finds himself unable to show vulnerability with his spouse. But Foucault would add another layer to this understanding. He would say that power isn't just about what happened to you as a child. It's also about the broader social narratives you've absorbed throughout your life. Narratives about gender, about what constitutes a good relationship, about who should sacrifice for whom. Think about it. How many films have you watched where love is portrayed as one person saving another? How many stories celebrate the partner, usually a woman, who gives up her dreams for the relationship? How many jokes normalize the idea that marriage means losing your freedom, your identity, yourself? These narratives aren't neutral. They shape our expectations, our behaviors, and ultimately, the power dynamics in our relationships. They teach us that certain imbalances aren't just normal, they're romantic. The wife who manages her husband's emotions, anticipating and preventing his outbursts. The husband who makes the financial decisions because he knows best. The partner who gives up friendships because the other is insecure. These dynamics aren't love, they're power masquerading as love. And they persist because we've been taught to confuse the two. But here's what's crucial to understand. Recognizing these patterns isn't about blaming your parents, your culture, or even your partner. It's about recognizing that the dynamics that feel most natural to you may not be serving you or your relationship. They may simply be what's familiar. In the next part, we'll examine how these dynamics manifest in everyday interactions, the subtle ways power asserts itself in even the most loving relationships, and how to recognize when healthy influence crosses into unhealthy control. Have you ever noticed how some discussions with your partner seem to follow a script? How certain topics inevitably lead to the same reactions, the same impasse, the same emotional aftermath? This isn't coincidence. It's a choreographed dance of power, one that both of you know by heart, even if neither of you has ever examined the steps. Let's look at what happens beneath the surface of these interactions. The partner who withdraws during conflict isn't just conflict avoidant. They're exercising power by removing their presence, by making themselves emotionally unreachable. The one who pursues isn't just needing closure. They're demanding engagement on their terms, insisting that their emotional timeline take priority. The person who brings up past mistakes during arguments isn't simply struggling to let go. They're establishing a position where the other remains perpetually on trial, perpetually proving themselves. The one who apologizes quickly to end disagreements isn't just keeping the peace. They're sacrificing their truth to maintain an illusion of harmony. These dynamics aren't always clear-cut. In fact, power in relationships often alternates, shifts, takes different forms in different contexts. The partner who defers to the other's preference about social plans might dominate when it comes to parenting decisions. The one who controls the finances might yield when it comes to emotional labor. And this is where Foucault's insights become particularly valuable. He understood that power isn't a simple matter of oppressor and oppressed. It's a complex network of influences, privileges, and vulnerabilities that we all navigate, sometimes occupying different positions in the same day or even the same conversation. Consider how often emotional vulnerability becomes a tool of power. "You're hurting me" can be an honest expression of pain, or it can be a way to shut down a conversation, to make the other person responsible for your feelings, to position yourself as the one who needs caretaking rather than accountability. Or think about the subtle power of expectations. The partner who expects the house to be clean when they get home. The one who expects constant texting throughout the day. The one who expects their sexual desires to take priority. These expectations aren't articulated as demands. They don't have to be. They function as unspoken laws that govern the relationship's territory. Even care can become a form of power. The partner who insists on handling everything because you don't do it right isn't just being helpful. They're establishing control, creating dependency, ensuring that their standards become the relationship's standards. Therapist Esther Perel points out that power dynamics often reveal themselves most clearly around decision-making. Who initiates sex? Who decides when it's time to leave a party? Who determines whether a conflict is resolved? Who chooses where to go on vacation, how to discipline the children, whether to relocate for a job opportunity? The answers to these questions tell you something profound about who holds what kind of power in your relationship. Not because some decisions are inherently more important than others, but because they reveal whose desires, whose comfort, whose vision of life together takes precedence when they conflict with the others. But perhaps the most insidious form of relationship power lies in what linguists call framing, the ability to define what's happening between you. The partner who says you're overreacting or you're too sensitive isn't just disagreeing. They're claiming the authority to define the other's reality. They're positioning themselves as the objective observer while relegating the other to the role of the irrational, emotional one who can't be trusted to interpret their own experience accurately. These dynamics don't necessarily mean your relationship is unhealthy or that anyone is intentionally manipulative. Power imbalances exist in every relationship. The question isn't whether they exist, but whether you're aware of them, whether they're fluid rather than fixed, and most importantly, whether they're consensual rather than coerced. In the next part, we'll explore how to recognize when these dynamics have become harmful, and the first steps toward creating more conscious, equitable patterns of relating. There's a crucial difference between influence and control, between power with and power over. One enriches relationships, the other diminishes them. One creates connection, the other breeds resentment. But how do you know which is operating in your relationship? The answer lies not in specific behaviors, but in their effects. Healthy power dynamics feel expansive. They create space for both people to grow, to express themselves authentically, to sometimes lead and sometimes follow. Unhealthy power dynamics feel constrictive. They require one or both people to become smaller, to hide parts of themselves, to rigidly maintain their assigned roles. Here are the warning signs that your relationship's power dynamic has become harmful. You constantly monitor your words, tone, and behavior to avoid triggering your partner's negative reactions. This isn't consideration, it's walking on eggshells, and it indicates that you've been made responsible for managing their emotions rather than them taking responsibility for their own responses. You've stopped sharing certain thoughts, feelings, or experiences because they don't fit the image your partner has of you or the narrative they've constructed about your relationship. This isn't privacy, it's self-erasure, and it suggests that being fully yourself has become dangerous to the relationship's stability. You find yourself explaining basic boundaries repeatedly, as if your right to have them is perpetually up for debate. This isn't communication, it's justification, and it reveals a dynamic where your autonomy is treated as negotiable rather than fundamental. You feel a sense of relief when your partner is happy with you and anxiety when they're not. This isn't love, it's emotional dependence, and it points to a situation where your sense of security has become contingent on their approval. Your perspective on events is routinely dismissed, minimized, or reinterpreted. This isn't a difference of opinion. It's a power move that undermines your trust in your own perceptions and positions your partner as the arbiter of reality. These patterns don't develop overnight, and they're rarely the result of conscious intention. More often, they emerge from both partners' unexamined wounds, beliefs, and adaptations. The partner who controls was often once controlled. The one who accommodates often learned early that accommodation was the price of love. Understanding this helps us approach these dynamics with compassion rather than blame. But compassion doesn't mean acceptance. It doesn't mean remaining in patterns that diminish you or allowing yourself to diminish others. So how do we begin to shift these dynamics? It starts with awareness, with noticing the subtle ways power operates in your relationship without defensiveness or denial. This means observing not just what happens between you and your partner, but how it makes you feel in your body, what it evokes in your emotional landscape, what parts of yourself it calls forth or suppresses. Next comes curiosity, asking questions rather than making accusations. I've noticed I tend to defer to your preferences about social plans. I wonder why that is. I realize I often withdraw when you express disappointment. What am I afraid would happen if I stayed present? These questions aren't about assigning blame. They're about understanding patterns that have become automatic. Then comes courage, the willingness to disrupt familiar dynamics even when doing so feels threatening. This might mean speaking when you would normally stay silent, staying present when you would normally withdraw, holding your ground when you would normally yield, yielding when you would normally insist on your way. And finally comes communication, not just about surface issues, but about the power dynamics themselves. I notice I feel like I need your permission to spend time with friends. That doesn't feel healthy to me. I realize I often dismiss your concerns about our finances. I think I'm afraid of feeling controlled, but that's not fair to you. These conversations aren't easy. They require vulnerability from both partners and a willingness to examine uncomfortable truths, but they create the possibility of something precious. A relationship where power is acknowledged, negotiated, and shared rather than wielded unconsciously. In our final section, we'll explore what becomes possible when relationships move beyond unconscious power struggles and into conscious partnership, and why this transformation is not just personal, but political. If you're in a relationship that involves harmful power dynamics, you'll find valuable insights in my book, Beyond Control: Building Relationships of Mutual Empowerment. It breaks down Foucault's ideas on power and gives you practical tools to recognize unhealthy patterns, communicate effectively about them, and create more balanced ways of relating. Link is in the pinned comment. What would it mean to create a relationship where power is conscious, fluid, and mutual? Where influence flows between partners, but control does not? Where difference is embraced rather than suppressed? Where vulnerability is understood as strength rather than weakness? It would mean, first and foremost, a relationship where both people can be fully themselves, where neither has to perform, pretend, or self-censor to maintain the other's comfort or the relationship's equilibrium, where both can express their truth without fear of abandonment or retaliation, where both can set boundaries without guilt and respect, boundaries without resentment. It would mean a relationship where conflict doesn't threaten but strengthens, where disagreement is approached not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to understand each other more deeply, where different perspectives are valued rather than threatening, where compromise emerges from mutual respect rather than capitulation or coercion. It would mean a relationship where help is offered without creating dependency, where care is given without expectation of return, where support empowers rather than diminishes, where both partners can be sometimes strong and sometimes vulnerable, sometimes certain and sometimes confused, sometimes the giver and sometimes the receiver. This vision isn't utopian. It's being lived by couples who have done the difficult work of examining their unconscious patterns, healing their relational wounds, and committing to more conscious ways of connecting. But it requires something significant: the willingness to give up the false security of rigid roles for the true security of authentic presence. Because that's what unconscious power dynamics really offer: a false sense of security. The illusion that if you just maintain your position as the strong one, the accommodating one, the logical one, the emotional one, the relationship will remain stable. But this stability comes at the cost of growth, intimacy, and ultimately, satisfaction. Real security doesn't come from controlling your partner or allowing yourself to be controlled. It comes from knowing that both of you can change, can express the full range of your humanity, can sometimes disappoint each other, and the relationship will not only survive, but deepen. This understanding transforms not just relationships, but individuals. When you're no longer performing a role, when you're no longer responsible for managing your partner's emotions or having your emotions managed, when you're no longer positioned as either strong or vulnerable, but allowed to be both, you become more fully yourself. Your energy, previously devoted to maintaining the relationship's power balance, becomes available for growth, creativity, contribution. And this transformation has implications beyond your relationship. Because as Foucault understood, personal dynamics and societal structures mirror and reinforce each other. The ways power operates in intimate relationships reflect and reproduce broader social inequalities around gender, race, class, ability, and more. When you commit to creating more conscious, equitable power dynamics in your relationship, you're not just improving your personal life. You're participating in a broader transformation of how humans relate to one another. You're helping to create a world where power is used not to dominate, but to elevate, not to control, but to connect, not to diminish, but to expand what's possible for all of us. So I ask you, what power dynamics are operating in your relationship, which serve you both and which constrain you? What would it mean to bring them into awareness, to discuss them openly, to consciously choose which to maintain and which to transform? These questions aren't easy to answer. They require honesty, courage, and a willingness to move beyond familiar patterns into new territory. But they open the door to something precious. A relationship where power is not a weapon but a gift that you share. Where influence flows between you but control does not. Where both of you can be fully, authentically, powerfully yourselves. If something in this video resonated with you, share in the comments one power dynamic you've noticed in your relationships. What role do you typically play? Has this pattern served you or limited you? Let's create a conversation about these hidden dynamics that shape our lives so profoundly. And don't forget to watch the next video. It builds directly on these insights and will help you take the next step in creating more conscious, fulfilling relationships. See you there.